Good morning, everyone. My name is Handa and I'm from Inspiring Women Changemakers. We're absolutely delighted to part sponsor this session. For those of you who haven't heard about Inspiring Women Changemakers, we're a digital community set up for changemakers like you to find, connect and be able to collaborate with each other. So do give us a follow on Twitter, Facebook, or all the other social media platforms, in fact. But this session is not about inspiring women change makers. It's about celebrating collaboration. And we've got two fantastic panelists for you this morning. So today, we have Karen Sweeney and we have Gurpreet Virdee. I'll introduce them formally in a moment. We still have a few people joining us. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we do get started. If you are able to put your video on, that's excellent. It's great to see faces when we're doing sessions like this, and particularly because we're discussing collaboration today. You will get an opportunity to speak as well in the breakout rooms and afterwards. But for the time being, if you wouldn't mind keeping your audio off while me or the panelists are speaking, that would be great, just to avoid any possible feedback. We will be recording this session, so again, if you're not comfortable with being recorded, do feel free to turn your video off. We won't be saying anything sensitive, I don't think, in this main room. So just please bear all of that in mind. So without further ado, I want to go straight into introducing Gurpreet and Karen. And I'm so excited about this session because we have Gurpreet from the Women and Girls Network in London, giving her perspective, her English perspective of the women and girls sector, and Karen, who's from Northern Ireland. And I think it will be really interesting to hear from each of them about how local dynamics might play a part. I caught the tail end of the previous session. I don't know if any of you were in that session as well, but I did hear the session host asking about local authorities and local dynamics. So it would be great to hear back from all of you after your breakout rooms. What part local dynamics play, if anything, in the way that you connect and collaborate. So let me introduce Gurpreet first. Gurpreet has been the director of the Women and Girls Network in London since 2010. She's got a strong commitment to anti-racism and fighting injustice faced by women and girls. And she spent the last 25 years working with specialist Black and minority-led organisations. Gurpreet's also played a pivotal role in responding to the impact of austerity and the survival and sustainability of FORG organisations in London. And the way she's done that has been through partnerships, consortia, campaigning and lobbying. Apart from being a director of her organisation, Gurpreet's also a trustee at End Violence Against Women and Girls Coalition, and also Race on the Agenda. So Gurpreet, I'm going to hand over to you. I would love it if you would share with the audience, please, just some of your experience about partnerships. It's that word that some of us might dread. We hear it from funders, and we hear that word partnership and we think, here we go, we have to form a partnership really quickly. So what we want to hear this morning is how do we create trusted and sustainable partnerships that last the duration and well beyond the start and finish of a funded programme, for example.
Okay, thank you. So over the last decade, as you all know, there's been considerable changes to the funding landscape, and with a significant shift to localism, which has enabled local authorities to make key decisions around commissioning and funding of services. There's also been a significant shift from grant funding to commissioning of services, which in turn has also meant that service provision has also had quite a lot of shaping by funders. Commissioning models have often prioritised cost over expertise, with funders seeking mainstream one-size-fits-all services over funding a variety of smaller or specialist services. This, coupled with huge funding cuts, has inevitably led to the loss of some services, particularly specialist BME services across the UK, who were and continue to be disadvantaged by commissioning processes. So, for example, obviously the lack of resources, the timing, capacity, timescales, etc., and also the general shift more towards generic provision. These changes place women's organisations in direct competition, not only with the wider voluntary sector, but with each other, risking huge fragmentation in the sector and the potential loss of even more of our services. In direct response and defiance to this, Women's Resource Centre invited women's organisations to get together to strategise against this and to consider forming a consortium that would prevent us from having to bid against each other and would actually help us to protect specialist services. It took almost 2 years of regular meetings and discussions, initially only by a handful of organisations, to establish the London Violence Against Women and Girls Consortium in 2011, now the largest consortium of specialist VAWG organisations working across all 32 boroughs in London and with a membership of over 30 organisations. Since 2011, a number of partnerships have been developed within the consortium aimed at developing and delivering a range of services from advice and counselling to ending harmful practices, and also developing prevention and advocacy services for young people. The consortium has been hugely successful, not without challenge, definitely not without challenge, but has been successful, and over the last 4 years alone has benefited from £22.7 million of funding. Having been involved in the consortium from the early development days to now, I felt it would be useful to draw on that and the experiences of that to thinking about how to build sustainable partnerships and how to navigate some of the challenges associated with partnership working. So in terms of the first question, how do we create sustainable, trusted partnerships that are not reliant on specific funded programs? So there was a few crucial points for me around this. Firstly, whenever possible, identify organisations that you are aligned to in terms of values, ethos, vision, and those that you have common goals with. If you can do this without the looming pressure of a funding deadline or a funding application that you're about to submit in, it can really help establish trusting, meaningful relationships with strong foundations, which are then sustainable beyond just the funding. In short, wherever possible, I would say build partnerships and then seek the funding rather than seek partners merely because a funder requires you to do that. Partnerships need to be genuine, they need to be mutually beneficial, they need to have depth and mutual respect to have the longevity. Secondly, be clear about the objectives of the partnership. What do you want to gain from it and what do you want to be able to contribute? Be realistic about the time and resource that partnerships actually take, because I think they always take longer than you think, or they take more than you think. The differences in organisational culture and how that could affect the relationship, and any compromises and changes that you are willing to make, because obviously inevitably working as a partnership, there are sometimes compromises that you need to make, but also you need to think about those that you aren't willing to make. What are your red lines? Because I think that's also really, really important, is not to compromise your integrity and your ethos. Work in a collaborative way whereby partners are mutually supportive, respectful, and have an equal voice, valuing the skills, knowledge, specialisms, and expertise that each partner brings, and crediting and acknowledging that so that others know that that's also their work. Communication and transparency are key. Communicate early and throughout. Actively listen to others, ensure that everyone is heard, take responsibility for mistakes, and have mutual respect. This is particularly important for lead organisations who inevitably, as lead, hold a particular type of power in partnerships and should therefore also lead in fostering a culture of openness and honesty and being open to that constructive challenge and feedback. If there aren't safe options for open conversations, then the things that are unsaid or unchallenged often manifest into bigger problems and can lead to the breakdown of potentially long-lasting good partnerships. In terms of the second question, how to navigate the gatekeepers within partnerships and systems, because inevitably there are always some. Partnership working has its challenges, and one of the key challenges is the power imbalance that can occur between partners, be that between the lead and the other partner projects, or generic versus specialist organisations, or larger versus smaller organisations, and so forth. A number of power dynamics can and do come into play. There are a number of things that can be done to address this. So engage all partners from the start and throughout. This helps to identify potential challenges, address logistics, highlight needs and expectations, as well as generate ideas and innovation. whilst capacity or time is limited for the partnership, whilst it is often limited for the partnerships, ensure that all partners are engaged in making key decisions, for example, target and budget setting, as this could save a lot of difficulties once the project is set up and running. Some of the most challenging times that we've had within the consortium has been as a direct result of partners not being involved in the final target and budget setting, which in turn took a knock-on effect to the struggles that they experienced to meet targets and had to find ways to subsidise budgets. So insist on transparency from the start and insist on involvement in those key decisions. Accountability frameworks. Organisations who are disadvantaged or treated unfairly need to be able to have access to support to address any issues, whether that is through governance structures, quality standards, complaint procedures, or through reverting to written agreements. There have to be mechanisms in place to ensure that organisations who are able to, that organisations are able to hold to account others where necessary and without the repercussions for those raising concerns. One of the most recent examples of this is the anti-racist charter and the call to action, which the consortium has committed to and therefore can now be held accountable against. And then finally, inclusion and access, actively enabling and encouraging participation at a strategic level. Partners not in receipt of funding or not leading a partnership can often be excluded from having direct contact with funders and access to other strategic spaces, such as VORG strategic boards or other kind of policy making boards. Therefore, ensuring that partners are able to give, ensuring that partners are given ample opportunities to be at the table can help enable exposure and relationship building opportunities for partners with funders, for example, as well as have the ability to influence policy, provide direct feedback around services and support capacity building opportunities. I lied, there's one last point. Sorry, there's one last point.
That's okay, Gurpreet. Thank you. There's gold in this.
Oh, sorry. So the last key point on this for me is that is one that we're actually still working on. And it's about achieving more equitable funding distributions amongst partners and to explore what opportunities there are for the largest beneficiaries to disinvest some of their service delivery and to focus on fewer activities and access less resource, ultimately laying the foundations for a more equitable funding in the future. And finally, for us, Women and Girls Network, all I can say is that being part of the London Board Consortium at the point that we became part of it basically saved us from near collapse.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think that end bit is great, and we'll definitely come back to that in our panel discussion after the breakout room sessions as well. So you've touched on some important points there that I do want to ask you about later on, Gurpreet. So what were some of the challenges? You've obviously mentioned a couple. You've talked about power dynamics and so on. I'm sure Karen will build on some of the themes that you've just mentioned, but and the red lines, but also giving credit where it's due. And when I talk about power dynamics within partnerships, I love to talk about what the emotions that we feel, you know, where's the generosity, where's the vulnerability, how can we put ego aside as lead funders or commissioners to really hear each other. You also mentioned the anti-racism charter. I'm facilitating a session on that tomorrow at just after 10 o'clock. So for those of you who do want to hear more about the anti-racism charter, do come along to that session tomorrow. But I'm going to come over now to Karen, who is the director of the Women's Support Network in Northern Ireland, which was formed in 1989. And the Women's Support Network is a membership organisation for community-based women's centres. And I believe she's going to tell us a bit about that partnership for women's projects and for infrastructure groups. She's also involved in Raise Your Voice, which is a project to tackle sexual harassment and sexual violence across Northern Ireland. So like Gurpreet, Karen's just got absolutely lots to share with us this morning. So Karen, over to you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. As Anja said, I'm the director of the Women's Support Network. I think Gurpreet stole all my notes overnight somewhere and has mentioned nearly everything. So I'll maybe give you the perspective of our own work and the partnerships that we have built and how many, and in fact, most of all of our work would be in partnership with different organizations and same organizations. The Women's Support Network is unique in itself that it was set up by and to support the women's centres across Northern Ireland, particularly in the first instance when it was set up. It was the 5 Belfast women's centres. Now, the women's centres here provide local frontline services for women in terms of childcare, training, education, advice, support, counselling, and work in some of our most disadvantaged areas. So it was set up as a united voice to lobby and to advocate on behalf of the women's centres while they got on with, I suppose, delivering those crucial frontline services. And even from my cut was in some of the first session, you know, they are busier than ever now with the cost of living crisis and everything that's happening. But that the Women's Support Network was then extended out to cover 14 women's centres across Northern Ireland, apart from the first 5. So we would still advocate, lobby, do research that can support funding, their funding applications. They would all be independently funded from a cocktail of funding. So we would also carry out research, make sure do public consultations with the local women to have their voices. And we do that under what we also call, it's the Women's Regional Consortium, which we're a member of, and that is 7 regional organisations. And that's, I don't like to come to the negative bit, but maybe to explain that there was like a failed and flawed tendering for services back in 2013. And I say flawed because it was awarded and then withdrawn. And what happened was between the 3 tenders that were into government, there was 7 organisations. So instead, with all the flaws that were unearthed, they brought the 7 of us together in a series of meetings and said, you know, we're going to put you all into the consortium. So it was almost like a forced partnership, if you like. And at the time, actually, there was a secret ballot for who would be the lead partner for those that wanted to put themselves forward. So, as I say, that was a difficult, and it wasn't a strong footing for a partnership because there was mistrust, there wasn't total agreements. There was, yes, we put a partnership agreement in place looking at, you know, for any complaints and all the things that you've mentioned, Gurpreet, you know, but because of it was a rocky start, it is still going. And it is much smoother now. That's all I can say. A lot of the things have been smoothed out, ironed out, and much more collaborative and more trust and flow of information. But from that and that work that happened over the years, it wasn't, as I say, an easy process. But some of the partners within that built very strong relationships because we weren't getting flow of information at times, and we would be phoning each other and saying, do you know about this? Do you know about that? You know, things. But we looked at how we could work in partnership, and we came together and we looked at how we could increase our spread right across Northern Ireland. We looked at our specialities and how, like with Women's Support Network, you were bringing in local women from 14 women's centres and other organisations. One of the other organisations could bring in all the rural groups. So we thought, well, we have a good working relationship here. Can we build on that? And that's when we actually started. We did a lot of planning on what we could do and how we could do it. And we have, as you mentioned, and that we applied under the ROSA UK Justice and Equality for the Raise Your Voice project. And as I say, there was a lot of planning and totally in equality throughout the application, deciding who was going to be the lead, what roles we would each have within that project. We set up even a group WhatsApp for all the partners. We had regular meetings. We had this, as you mentioned, open and honesty that we could speak. If there was any problems, we'd speak to each other about them. And we built a very strong partnership. And from that, we've also now that partnership has garnered in other funds to support through the UK Community Renewal Fund. We applied in partnership, long hours through that one of the application process, but that was to garner in training. It was under the People and Skills to bring in training and education funding for training education for women in the community, because here in Northern Ireland, none of our government departments provide any money towards training and education in the community sector. We have heavily in the past relied on European funding, but as you know, that's coming to an end. So that was a way, and as I say, it works. Again, we decided on the lead. We knew it before doing the application, what roles everybody would have, making sure we had very regular meetings, and in the beginning, weekly meetings. They've moved further apart, but we made sure that everything flowed and that everybody knew what everybody was doing. And it's that how that we have found that openness, transparency, and sharing of information that has been key to the partnership. In terms of WSN, we are also, and I was on this meeting today, we're a partner with 14 women's organisations across England, Scotland, and we're the Northern Ireland partner in the Solace Labyrinth project. So that's an opportunity which we've never had before, to work across other parts of the UK. We haven't got to meet each other in person yet, but we're hoping to, and it has been difficult. But I suppose that's one thing that COVID Zoom has made it easier to connect and have meetings, and even more regular meetings. Because when you're going in person to organisations that are spread across, that takes time and planning. And so I think that in a way, if there's something good to be said about Zoom and COVID and Teams and all those things, that can be used to strengthen and support your delivery of projects, but especially collaboration.
Absolutely.
But we've done everything we have. And in terms, I'll just go back very quickly to, again, it's government departments wanting to work through a lead partner that's forcing some, as I say, the Women's Support Network has always been there to advocate on behalf of the 14 women's centres, and has worked that way without any formal, but government now wants us to put a formal partnership in place so that the WSN will be a lead on a certain fund that currently is delivered individually to each of the women's centres to do with Women's Centres Childcare Fund, so that they can only come through WSN as the lead, and they say it's all around the confidentiality and everything. So again, it's government that's forcing us sometimes to legalise and formalise, where something that has worked for over 30 years.
Absolutely. I think let's hear about that now, Karen. Let's move over to the breakout rooms and discuss how some of these barriers that you have both articulated, how they're impacting other people around the UK as well. So again, some really important topics from Karen about flawed and failed tendering processes, that need for open communication, and so on. So it's all of your opportunity now. We're going to go into breakout rooms for 10 minutes, and then we will come back just after that. I'll broadcast into the rooms. We want to hear from you, and I've popped into the chat what's working, what are the barriers, and are there any ways that Rosa could maybe help all of you with some of the influencing piece around maybe local dynamics, or are there other partnerships that could support you? So we're going to go into 5 breakout rooms now. I can see about 25 people on screen, so give or take there'll be 5 of you. When I bring you back, I would like to just hear a point or two from a designated person from each of your groups. So feel free to put your videos on when you're in the breakout rooms, and then we'll have a short discussion based on some of the themes that have come up within the breakout rooms about what has worked for you. We've had some great examples from both of our 2 panelists, but we'd love to hear more. So I'm going to pop you into your rooms now, and we'll see you back at about 10 to 12. Welcome back, everyone. I think we've got everyone now. So before we went into breakout rooms, we'd heard from Gurpreet and Karen on some of their barriers and some of the things that have worked for them, such as honesty, open communication, clear and defined roles, being some of the things that worked positively. We also heard about where things do get skewed, for example, where funders are setting the course of action, or the funding stream is resulting in partnerships being set up quickly without having had the time to build the trust or the relationships in some cases. So it would be great to hear from your groups. I asked you to designate one or two people to feedback a couple of points. So do we have a volunteer? I'm just going to go in order. Who have we got from group one that's willing just to share a couple of things from their own group?
Hi, I can.
Thank you.
I think I was in group one. I'm pretty sure I was. I actually probably talked the most as well. Sorry, I kind of took over a bit there. So I'm from the Labyrinth project, which I think Jan very briefly mentioned in her section earlier. So I think just a couple of points that I found. So our project, as Jan said, is working nationally across England, Scotland, Northern Ireland. And I think what's been really good is the flexibility that we've had in this project to really be able to address like local issues and to sort of, as lead partner at Solace, I've really tried, I think, to make sure that each partner can sort of do what fits for their area and allow for that flexibility, not just in activities, but in time, and having time to like think about what they need to do. In terms of barriers, I think the project, once we got underway, it's really only been a year, really, I'd say, of delivery. We're coming almost to the close at the end of September, and it just kind of feels like we've just got started. Like, we've been able to do lots of great activity, but actually in building that partnership and working together, it still feels like in very early days. And now it's sort of like, oh, now what? How do we carry that on afterwards? And it almost was impossible without having more funding to be able to do that. So I'd say like short-term length, which I know everyone has an issue with in contracts, in projects, etc. I think also something, again, that maybe only apply to us, I don't know, but having to like figure out everything that you need to do in advance of getting a partnership or a project underway. So for example, we have training partners who are delivering training for us, and while they've been amazing and they're fantastic organizations, some of that training offer we've realized as we've gone along is already being done already, and we're not actually offering anything that new. So if we'd maybe had more flexibility in to be able to work out what we needed to do as the partnership developed, rather than have to come up with that for our funder in advance, that would have been more helpful, I think.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, and common themes that I'm certainly familiar with as well. So thank you. That was group one. If there's anyone else from group one that wants to chip in, do feel free to do that in the chat. Who do we have from group two? Room two, rather. Gurpreet.
So it was myself, Sally, Aqua, and Laura, but we had a few technological problems, so we didn't get to hear anything from Laura. And I mean, Sally and Aqua, please feel free to speak about what some of the issues were. But the thing that kind of came about was really that these are two very new charities that are in the very, very early stages of being set up. So at the moment, we're not even at the stages of exploring, I guess, partnerships as such. It's more about just setting the actual organizations up and just some of the challenges around that, and even just securing those initial funds to be able to begin to do some of that first stages of work, and just having kind of key coordinators in role. I think there's a lot of volunteering at the moment that's happening with kind of key members that are involved in those two organisations.
Brilliant, thank you. Is there anyone else from Gurpreet's group that wants to add anything?
I think so as a startup, we're from the Active Pregnancy Foundation, is that, again, we were mentioning the having to talk to your community, the people that you're wanting to work with or work for, and finding those relationships quite difficult to set up in the first instance. So, you know, a new charity, they don't know about us, they don't know what we provide, they don't even know what they need. So actually having those conversations is really very difficult, and we could spend a lot of our time trying to reach those communities, and actually, you know, just paying for things like translation services is so expensive, and just we're unable to do it because we haven't got the community telling us that they need it. So it's tough, but we're working on it. There's a lot of passion.
Great, thank you for that, Sally. Right, let's move over to group 3. We didn't have a group 4 in the room 4 in the end. So room 3, who do we have? Karen?
Well, I speak, yes. So I'm afraid with talking of the time flew by, but sort of we mentioned more barriers than anything that came up just, and that would be around, you know, the gatekeeping, local authorities, fear and fear of competition, also losing your own identity, but also losing your own, it was brought up about, you know, you can be maybe package, get all your information, maybe it's research or something, but it's taken over by a leader, taken over by another organization, rebranded and put out as their work when it has been your work. So that was some of the barriers. I think, if does anybody else want to come in on? And we didn't get, but you know, there was good points that we raised, but then we didn't unfortunately get to all the questions. Sorry.
That's absolutely okay. Great. Room 5. Let's hear from room 5.
I think that was our room. So I was with Marsha and Rizwana, and we were in a very similar situation to room 2 in that it was new organizations, and so we spent a bit of time talking about some of the challenges of kind of getting established in community, and perhaps just you know, what forms of incorporation would be best for different organizations. But we did talk a little bit about being committed to shared values in kind of forming partnerships. I think, and the difference between working in larger and smaller organizations. I think that's all we got to. Marsha or Rizwana, please jump in.
I think that was pretty much it, wasn't it? That yeah, there's some of the barriers that you have, or difficulties that there are with working in a big organization. And then when you then set up yourself, and then you realize you've become all these bodies in one, and there's only 1 or 2 of you doing all those roles, whether it be HR or, you know, communication, whatever you're doing, supporting everything, it's very difficult. And I know Rizwana was talking about basically doing everything and not getting paid as well. Looking at, like, you know, funding, there's not enough. And I suppose it'd be really good to have somewhere that for people, whether they're new, setting up new, whether they're there and just been doing as a community group or a CIC, but somewhere where we could get that information, where that's ready, you know, that knowledge is readily available to help people, rather than as people struggling in silo. I think that's really difficult. Yeah.
There's a clear, I think, having heard from, and I'm going to invite Karen and Gurpreet to join in now, you know, putting some questions back to them. But with all of the work I do, and just even the discussions we've had today, there are some clear additional challenges for the very small women's sector organisations, just in terms of your capacity, whether that's, you know, time, people, other resources, and the dynamics within those conversations, and especially when you are newer and reputationally you haven't established that in your local area yet. So you know, forums like this, the fact that Rose has given you this space to connect and collaborate, do use it. Make sure you're using the chat, share each other's contact details in this space as well. Follow each other on Twitter, because that silo working that Marsha's just talked about, that's real and it happens. And actually, you know, sometimes organisations do on the surface look like they're working in competition, but it doesn't have to be that way. So I'll go to Karen first, and then Gurpreet, I'll come to you. Do you want to respond to any of those points that I've just made there?
I would also say reach out. I mean, to some other organisations. You might, you know, and similar, you'll find that a lot of them who are more established are willing to help out smaller organisations and charities get off the ground. You know, the sharing, what we found through the network is that sharing of policies, even, you know, broad line job descriptions, different things that we can pass on between the different women's centres and organisations, that has works well. There's also, which I hadn't mentioned, Women's Support Network through Rosa were funded to establish rape crisis service here in Northern Ireland. Now, what we did in doing that, because there had been nothing here for over 16 years in terms of rape crisis, but we reached out to Scotland, England and Wales, to Rape Crisis Ireland, and they've been so supportive, you know, in terms of getting all our policies and procedures and everything in place. So there are, you know, people are willing. I know there's competition, we're all struggling to fight for the funding, but I think you will get support. You know, there will be organisations that will help you get established. So yeah, don't be afraid to reach out and ask for the help.
Excellent, thank you. And I can see that Anna's put in the chat, we have a networking session over lunch where you can meet and connect. And so that's one way that Rosa is trying to facilitate collaboration between you all. So do take them up on that. And I'm just popping in, I'm going to pass over to Gurpreet for her reflections as well. And while we do that, I'll make sure I pop in the hashtag for today's conference. Do find each other that way, do tweet about what you've heard or learnt today as well, please. That would be great. So Gurpreet, what reflections do you have?
Yeah, I mean, I actually echo a lot of what Karen said. I think sometimes it is very, very daunting. And I know that, you know, Women and Girls Network is now quite a large organisation, but, you know, 10 years ago, we were a very small organisation. And I think, you know, we absolutely, and I think through partnerships in particular, we're able to access a lot more resource and support. And there was a lot of learning and capacity building for us that took place, which has kind of really helped us develop and grow over the years. So I would absolutely echo just trying to reach out to organisations that maybe are a little bit ahead of the game in terms of they're being more established, but also absolutely, you know, sort of utilising things like policies and stuff, which can be quite costly to get someone to do for you, but also, you know, are available and kind of, you know, sort of well-written policies that people are willing to share. So definitely those things, but also local sort of grants, and you know, like when you get small, like local authority do grants and stuff, so they might kind of be quite small fees, but actually there's a bit more flexibility and less kind of bureaucracy involved in what that money can be used for. So sometimes if you do need to buy in some additional support to help get you set up, to kind of help with that sort of infrastructure support, then I'd also say look there, because I think, you know, it sometimes can be like up to £5,000, but that can be quite a world of difference in those early days.
Absolutely. And also don't forget your local CVS organisations and similar, and community foundations that often put on information and awareness raising events for organisations like yours. They're great places to network, find out, especially for those of you who have said, you know, you're slightly newer in your development. It's just a great way to let people know about what it is you do. So now that we are back to face-to-face networking, or even the online networking, just making use of those spaces. I've mentioned in the chat the small charity chief exec group that even though I'm not a small charity chief exec, I am a small charity chair, and I find it a really great place for peer support and being able to share the kind of policies and processes that Gurpreet's mentioned. And do ask, I've found over the years that larger organisations where they do have legally compliant documents are happy to share them. But also think about, you know, just coming back to the values that we talked about, that's been a really strong theme. And Gurpreet, I can hear you nodding, and I do want to come back to that point that you said about some of the challenges, because we haven't heard those from you yet. Was about these strong values, and how do you, are you clear on your own? I think the starting point really in terms of collaboration, especially for those of you who either are new or maybe haven't done a strategy day for a while, have you really sat down with your board or with your professional team and thought about why are we here? Why are we doing what we do? Why is this important? Because when you're clear on that, that helps with the partnerships, because it rules organizations in and it rules them out. So Gurpreet, I'm just going to come back to you, if I may, on some of the challenges with respect to collaboration that you didn't have a chance to mention earlier, and then I'm going to come back to Karen as well.
I think some of the kind of key challenges for us, and I think one of the big ones really that kind of, I think still 10 years later still kind of feels quite prominent in the consortium for us, is that very few organizations are in a position to be able to lead partnerships. So it kind of ends up being the same few organizations that either put themselves forward or are selected to lead partnerships. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. So, you know, I think one of the kind of key reasons, and this is where I think funders like Rosa could probably help, is that funders have a stipulation, I guess, that, you know, something like, for example, London councils will say, you know, 50% of your income can't be from this funding stream that you're, or this, sorry, let me say that again. This funding that you're applying for can't be more than 50% of your annual income. Now, if you're applying for, on behalf of a partnership, you know, absolutely, that's probably going to be quite likely. Now, I get that from their point of view in terms of due diligence and risk management, that they have to think about those things. But it really makes partnership working and putting in a partnership bid quite challenging for smaller organizations. So I would say that that's one thing to kind of, for funders to sort of think about and look at, because it probably means either you go in with very small partnerships, which is you and another organization or so, or that you're kind of in this situation where you're generally just a partner and never able to be a lead until you kind of get to a particular level of funding yourself. So and I think that doesn't allow us to always dismantle the kind of power dynamics that exist then within partnerships, and it just almost means that the bigger organizations get bigger and the smaller organizations kind of just stay where they are. And I think some of the things that I mentioned earlier about what, you know, being a lead gives you access to, you know, opportunities, it gives you access to funders, it gives you access to strategic spaces. And so what's our role then as leads to make sure that others are brought in to those spaces? Because we understand the kind of the criteria set by funders, but actually then we have a responsibility as leads to say, right, well, in those spaces, we're going to insist that the partners come with us, that they get that exposure, they get to have that direct contact, that, you know, those relationships are also built there directly with the partners. So I think it's some of those sort of things, and, you know, really navigating that, because I think that's been for us particularly quite you know, an ongoing issue that we haven't quite, you know, managed to resolve. But I think we're finding ways to establish good practice in, you know, while we can't necessarily change what funders kind of want.
They're really brilliant points, and I think a great tip for any larger organizations or lead partners, just how you amplify the voices of your smaller partners, but also how you give them that exposure, and that these are the things that build trust within the partnerships. So Karen, reflections from you, because you had two real examples of where you had a large partnership that worked well because it had already been set up, and then when when regional dynamics came in, things changed and took a while to get back on track.
Yes, just I would echo some of the things there, and I had actually written that down. You know, for funders, we faced that same kind of thing where, you know, the lead could only be the larger organization because of how the funding is set up and one of the and how the criteria is set up. But it's also making sure that, you know, when you have a lead that shows the other partners, and that's something that we found was that that we were equitable across, and we met funders together, and the funders were willing not only to go, but what we did find, we still find a lot of the time, is even our elected representatives and things will go to the lead, and they don't see past the lead partners in a lot of cases, you know, for exposure and things like that. And you just need to make sure that you have that transparency, that the lead isn't then taking, you know, all the credit as well for the work that's maybe happening actually because of all the smaller partners. So so it's about having those good a lead that isn't a gatekeeper, I suppose, that isn't taking the credit, doing all the networking in the right places and not getting everybody else seen. But I just think it's something that has to be worked at, and you have to get your grounding right to begin with, and a lot of planning and honest, open conversations, and to have those all the way through. As I say, if there's any problems, right, you should have a forum where you do not and are not afraid to come and speak out and say, this doesn't work for me. Is there something we can change or look at?
Yeah. Absolutely brilliant points, Karen. Thank you. Thank you to both of our panelists for their contributions. I think they gave us some real food for thought, and thank you everyone for your participation in the breakout room. So some of my reflections from today's session were really about that, being mindful about who you form your alliances with, who your partnerships are with, having that open and clear and transparent communication between partners, and if it's not working, how can you respectfully step away as well, you know, before you even enter into the agreement? What are the parameters with respect to that partnership and the consequences as well? So I think for us as women's sector organisations, it doesn't really matter what size you are, do your own due diligence as well before you enter into those partnerships. I'm getting some feedback from somewhere. I'll just turn on to mute. And then the trust. How do we build trust? We've had some great examples again from Gurpreet, Karen, and from others about where you've networked and formed those relationships so that a partnership is ready should some funding be there. But also think proactively about where you might apply for funding or put in some kind of tender if that is applicable in your local area. And finally, the point about using Rosa's lunch and networking to best effect. Enjoy the rest of the conference. I hope to see some of you tomorrow. I believe Anna is going to pop into the chat about our next session, which is a Q&A with Meet the Funder. So what could be better? It flows really well from this session, but I look forward to seeing some of you throughout the rest of the conference. Hopefully I'll see you in my session tomorrow, and have a brilliant day ahead. Thank you. And thank you, Gurpreet and Karen, so much for a brilliant session. Some great points from both of you.
Thank you all. Thanks, Karen.
Yeah.
Nice to meet you
No,
all.
thank you.
Take care. Great to be connected.
Thank
Think it went well. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
Take care, Ange, too.
Bye. Take care, everyone.
Right.
age, but try to press on meeting floor.
Yeah.